Here we're going to be discussing the advantages and disadvantages of a subsidy. So first of all, one of the advantages is that it can be paid directly and immediately increase supply, creating jobs and also protecting them if the businesses are in trouble. So back in 2008, in the form of a kind of a very direct subsidy, the UK government bailed out 2 banks. Now, before I write down, try and think about who these 2 banks were. And there were Lloyds and there were RBS. And these 2 banks were, I think between them, they had around 700,000 employees in the UK and worldwide. And if they had let them go bust, or bankrupt, or into administration, they would have lost all of those jobs pretty much. And that would have caused an even bigger negative multiplier effect in the UK economy. So therefore, by doing that, you're protecting the jobs. Now, more interestedly, we want to create jobs and we want to be able to increase the supply of the good that we're producing. And we want to be kind of compensated for it as well, of course. So how does it create jobs? It's because what you're doing is you're increasing the supply. You need more people to be able to produce those goods. And because you're earning a higher price as well, as a producer, you're able to pay more and you can gain better quality of staff potentially. And thus creating these important job roles for your company and for the rest of the economy, creating that positive multiplier effect. Secondly, prices are kept low for consumers. Absolutely. We're becoming more and more allocatively efficient. Okay, so this is where we're increasing quantity at lower prices and making it more and more beneficial for consumers. And if you're reducing prices for consumers, what does that mean for consumer surplus? Happy days. Consumer surplus should be increasing because the willingness to pay for a good versus what they are now currently paying on, including the subsidy, is great. It's much higher. Thirdly, this incentivizes investment projects and encourages FDI and innovation. Basically, what we're talking about here is dynamic efficiency. In all my videos, I mention these efficiencies. Okay, and there is another video we're going through all the efficiencies and what they are. So make sure you go through that if you can. Basically, just to remind them, a dynamic efficiency is where they utilize supernormal profits, or they use the money that or the revenues that they have, or the cash flow that they have, and reinvest it into greater levels of innovation and research and development to build better products, new products, invest into new projects. If you've got subsidies, that's just cash flow coming into your business. This is going to attract investment, not just from the UK domestically, but this is going to attract foreign direct investment as well, so from other countries. And I gave an example in the other video with Nissan, and therefore it allowed them to have a grant available to them that gives them the ability to increase their supply. Moving on, it improves equality and equity in society, reducing the risk of social exclusion. So what do we mean by this, and what's the difference between equality and equity? And equality is basically where everybody receives their the same amount. So therefore, no 2 different individuals or households or businesses receive conflicting amounts of that good or service. Equity, being more equitable, is to do with earning your fair share, so having your fair share. If you have a millionaire, multi-million pound or a high cash flow business versus a business that's predominantly going bankrupt or bust, the people that need the subsidies potentially can be argued that not the high cash flow company, but more so the company that needs the support in order to stay afloat and keep the business going and the employees in the business. So by providing subsidies, it improves equality and equity for sure, reducing the risk of social exclusion. Now, I must add, going back to this example with Lloyds and RBS, if they hadn't bailed them out, the entire financial system would have crumbled globally. And that's because they had so many liabilities, so many investments around the world on absolute rubbish. I think the last straw, for those finance geeks out there, the last straw was when they purchased ABN AMRO, which is a Dutch bank, for £25 billion or euros, I think it was, which was way above their market share, way overvalued. And ABN AMRO was an absolute terrible, basically worthless company at the time. So by providing subsidies, you stopped the hundreds of thousands of employees from losing their jobs and then creating negative multiplier effects across the rest of the UK and the world, to be fair. It does encourage diversity of offering. Now, if you have subsidies, so for example, just recently, we've had £26 million available in 2020 to the UK filmmakers industry. And this is to encourage kind of young, I think BAME, kind of people from BAME backgrounds, just ensuring that filmmakers and kind of sports and theatre societies aren't losing out as well on the side. But the filmmaking industry needs a lot more diversity. So this £26 million will go a long way in encouraging young filmmakers to contribute to that industry. And the UK's film industry is actually growing massively. And just a prime example of how prevalent the UK film industry is basically 8 out of 10 3D movies in the world, or in Hollywood basically, are produced in the UK. So 80% of the 3D movies that we have in circulation are produced in the UK. Okay, and just last but not least, one of the advantages which we mentioned here, the first one, it protects businesses and jobs. And I want to talk about the furlough scheme. And this is a scheme that for some reason you economics students aren't too familiar with, even though you hear it every day. And the furlough scheme is basically where the government subsidize wages up to 80%. Okay, and basically the business would fire you or make you redundant otherwise. So what they want to do is the government is saying, look, keep the staff members on, we'll pay their 80% of their wages. But keep them on, don't fire them. Wait till coronavirus dies out and we will pay for their 80% of their wages. You can contribute towards the other 20%. If you don't want to, it's fine. They can just live with the 80%, which is potentially in the short run. Okay, now that's going to go on for a little while. It will be extended if it hasn't already by the time of your watching this video. And it protects jobs. What it does, it just protects the firms from letting go of their workers. Because if they do that, this will create a massive negative multiplier effect. It will create loss of further jobs in other industries. So the fact that I can earn some money, I'm then going to go to Costa and spend money in Costa, and then I'm going to go to a restaurant and buy food at a restaurant. So I'm keeping the economy going via the circular flow of income. Okay, and that's the whole purpose of this furlough scheme, to make sure that consumption keeps going. I know these are macro points, but to ensure that consumption keeps circulating around the economy is key. Okay, now the disadvantages. The disadvantage is very expensive. Very, very expensive. It can result in increased tax charges for future generations, which it does do. It can also be unsustainable, especially if the budget deficit is growing. And there's a massive opportunity cost. Now, the £26 million to the UK filmmaking industry, okay, great, that's fine, amazing what it's going to do. But we have 350,000 homeless people in the UK. That's quite a lot. And where's the priorities here? So that £26 million could have easily given at least £100 to each of those workers, each of those homeless people. So opportunity cost. Going back to our first ever video on scarcity and choice, there is huge opportunity cost here with regards to the amount of money being spent on subsidies. Now the bailouts were in the tens of billions. That's the problem. Tens of billions of pounds to save two companies? Really? Okay, I'm sure if imagine just giving £10,000 to each member of society, wouldn't that have been better? Because £10,000 could go a long way for a lot of people. So there is a huge opportunity cost. They can spend that money elsewhere. And if the budget deficit is growing, we're going to have something called crowding out, which is basically where, because the government borrow more and more and more and more in order to fund this budget deficit, they must borrow it from somewhere, and it's going to be from the investors in the UK predominantly. This then reduces the amount available to the rest of the economy, i.e. households and businesses, and this creates a crowding out effect where, because there's a lack of money supply left in the private economy because the banks are busy lending to the government, this then creates an element of crowding out where the banks, due to the lack of money supply, they have to charge higher prices, higher interest rates to the borrowers. Number two, which is something that I'm very worried about, and is moral hazard. They misuse subsidies sometimes, and they do. What should they spend money on? Whose decision is this? Is it the business's decision to spend money in the way in which they require, or is it the government dictating where this money should be spent? So, for example, in 2015, £2 billion was given to developers, housing developers, major housing developers. Now, why would you give £2 billion in grants to housing developers? And it's because they wanted them to produce and construct affordable housing. What's deemed affordable in the UK? Is it affordable 100 grand in London, or is it affordable £100,000 in Nottingham? Now, those two, £100,000 in London doesn't exist, number one. The average house price in London is £500,000. The rest of the UK, we're looking at around 230,000, 240,000. And why would they want to build affordable housing? And what's deemed affordable? Is £400,000 affordable? No. Not to the majority of the country. Absolutely not. So the major developers are getting this £2 billion, and they're still directing their time towards producing luxury homes or expensive homes, because that's where the most profit is. If you're taking into account the planning permissions required, the construction of it, the architecture, the actual decorations inside, and kitting it out and fitting it with the fixtures and fittings, etc. So firms, because the government just guaranteed this, they give it to them, and they can misuse these subsidies. And this is usually as a result of a lack of oversight and just a lack of questioning, really and truly. And that's the problem I have with subsidies. It's the fact that there's no follow-up a lot of the time. And it can lead to, I bring this in now, but like kind of subsidy capture, where the major developers and their CEOs will know the MPs or the cabinet members who are offering them their money, because they work quite closely with them on policy and so forth to make sure enterprises is going smoothly. But to solve the housing crisis and the supply, by giving £2 billion, it's resulting in information failure, because the government doesn't understand what or know what the developers are going to be doing with that money. And finally, one of the disadvantages is disincentive for firms to cut costs. Now, if I'm being given £2 billion, I'm not going to be incentivized to cut costs. Instead, I'm going to throw a massive lavish Christmas party. Or I'm going to be using higher grade material or higher quality material in my development, in my housing. So therefore, there is a disincentive for firms to cut their average costs. Okay, and that's resulting in something called X inefficiency. Alright, these are the advantages and disadvantages, so make sure you're quite clear on these.